The 16-bit Castlevania games had basically perfected the Castlevania formula, but the world was moving on. The New Generation and Vampire's Kiss, the last games released in this era, are actually the two worst-selling games in the entire Castlevania franchise. Castlevania had once been Konami's golden goose, but when 1997's Symphony of the Night came out, it was absolutely bodied by early 3D games. The market demanded 3D games, and so Konami were faced with two different ways that they could take the franchise. They could either double down and say, this is the way we've always done it, we're going to continue making 2D Castlevania games, or they could choose to adapt. They could embrace change. This was the era of franchises moving into the third dimension, and so Castlevania also had to take its first tentative flaps into the age of the polygon. Within 2 weeks of Symphony of the Night flopping like a dead fishman, Konami announced a hot new 3D take on their Ailing Whip-em-up to be released in the winter of that same year. This was a huge pivot. Here they were trying something new for the first time, but they had done this kind of thing before. Castlevania had been Konami's first handheld game. It had been their first CD-ROM game. Great things had always happened when they had moved out of their comfort zone. One of the cool facts about Castlevania is more often than not each new game would be made by an entirely new team. Konami would build a team around a few core veterans, and they would also throw in a bunch of devs with less experience. Each game would then be approached with fresh eyes. Constantly reinventing itself like this is pretty much what kept the Castlevania series so fresh for so long, and Castlevania 64 is no exception to this formula. Castlevania 64 was directed by Yuji Shibata, who was also the game's technical lead. No doubt taking a page from the Final Fantasy handbook, the new 3D Castlevania game would feature a semi-open world with Zelda-style RPG-light elements. There would be 4 players, with 4 separate storylines and 1 true ending once you'd played all 4. A lot of these things actually also didn't make it, but let's take a look at what we did get. Castlevania 64 features 2 playable characters, Reinhard Schneider and Carrie Fernandez. During development, Reinhard was actually called Schneider Belmont because he's supposed to be the latest in the Belmont clan, but at some point he got renamed. He is still considered to be a descendant of the Belmont clan, and Carrie Fernandez is a descendant of the Belnades clan. The story does actually get better later on, but at the beginning it doesn't seem like story was Konami's biggest concern. The manual in the opening story is probably the most vague of any of the Castlevania games up until this point. The long and the short of it is Dracula's awake again after his 100-year sleep, and 2 young warriors emerge from obscurity to go and whip the life out of him. Like in all Castlevania games, the opening level is all about teaching you the rules. Previous Castlevania games all have a tightly focused opening level, whereas Castlevania 64's opening level is less direct and more atmospheric. It's quieter, it's darker. As you're exploring the countryside leading up to Dracula's castle, you'll be whipping skeletons and torches and collecting sub-weapons and gems and moneybags. It's still Castlevania, but there's a much bigger focus on exploring these environments, on puzzling and platforming, rather than it just being this left-to-right whipfest. And that helps to set the tone that Castlevania 64 was trying to do something different from the very beginning. I do have to say though, the best thing about this opening stage is before you get to enter Dracula's castle, you have to fight this great big fella who is straight out of the Universal Monsters playbook. In my video about the birth of Castlevania, I spoke about how Konami were mining the depths of the Universal monster films in order to bring a unique and original atmosphere to their games. When you open these big double gates and a giant King Kong sized skeleton comes through, you can see that this team are still using that contextual continuity. It's still very Castlevania, but it's being presented in a completely new way. And these fellas on motorbikes who just appear out of nowhere, they're fantastic. What the history books won't tell you is that in fact Dracula invented the motorbike and he gave these sick lowriders to his raddest bone boys.
I give you the knowledge of immortals, the true science.
I genuinely love this. This is absolutely fantastic. King Kong and motorbikes. It sets the precedent really early on that Konami are having fun, they're being creative, and they're exploring all the new possibilities that this 3D world can offer. Once you get inside the castle, Castlevania 64 really finds its feet as a non-linear game. The castle is divided into all the different areas that you would expect from Dracula's castle, you know, hallways, torture chambers, dungeons, and so on. It even has castle grounds and gardens. There is a logical order that everything should be done in, but there's also a big focus on backtracking and puzzle solving. It feels like there's a bit of Resident Evil influence here, but it is still very Castlevania. You still have sub-weapons the same as you do in previous games, the axe, the boomerang, the knife, holy water, but what's different is your chosen character also has short and long range attacks. In the case of Reinhard, he has the whip for long range, but he also has a short sword for close range fighting. It doesn't have a tremendous amount of utility, I will say that, but it's a really good feature. It makes sense in this world and is the kind of thing that we would see appear in other 3D games of the time. Curiously enough, this is not something that we see repeated in Castlevania games. On first impressions, Castlevania 64 is a really decent early 3D game. It has adapted to a changing marketplace and is attempting to be creative and explore the possibilities of the 3D space. But you can see it isn't quite living up to the promise of that Tokyo Game Show trailer or those early Nintendo Power screenshots. Six months after Konami announced the game, EGM magazine reported that Castlevania 64 was 10% complete. That would have given Castlevania 64 a projected launch date of summer 2002. Project planners Takeo Yakishiji and Hiroshi Shibata both said in interviews that it was difficult to get up and running, not just doing 3D for the first time, but also developing for the N64 for the first time. The team at Konami were making development tools parallel to developing the game. And fair play, Konami wanted this game done in a year, so the team had to just eventually take the way of the Fremen and just cut out everything that wasn't complete in order to have something which was. I respect that mentality because at some point they just became focused on delivering rather than trying to shove more and more stuff in. Two of the characters ended up getting dropped. There was going to be boss fights which are going to be like a 3D fighter like Tekken. It's a real shame and it cannot be understated what a tremendous sea change it would have been moving to 3D, but Konami just grabbed that opportunity. They embraced change and they did the best they could with what they had. But in that 6 months, Konami got their fundamentals down. Rather than fighting against the N64's limitations, Konami did a great job of working with it. Where the N64's texture buffer was a little bit muddy, Konami were making good use of coloured lighting to inject extra atmosphere. Instead of attempting to cram loads of stuff on screen at once, instead Konami were focusing on getting their engine to output an extremely smooth 30 FPS. That doesn't sound like much now, but that is 10 FPS more than Nintendo got out of Ocarina of Time, and that is double what Rare got in GoldenEye. At these tolerances, getting an extra 10 or 20 FPS is a massive difference. And for what it's worth, the limitations that Konami faced, I think actually made this game come out potentially better. I like all the fogging. I like the fact there's fog inside the castle. I know a lot of people have said this doesn't look good, but this actually sparked my imagination even more. Like, this castle lives in the ground for 100 years at a time. There's no way that it wouldn't be all dusty and smoky and dirty on the inside. I really liked that. I certainly don't see any skeleton molly maids running around the place. I like the hokey, low poly 3D models. I think they're just full of charm, and there's something about the technical hurdle in early 3D games. It's a melding of not just art but also engineering. Masahiko Kimura, the guy who worked on the soundtrack, had also worked on Rondo of Blood, and the soundtrack that he does for this is really low key and synthy because the N64 just wasn't very good at delivering music. So again, the whole team is just embracing what they have and doing the best they can. The thing about all early 3D games though is the movement is all kind of floaty. It does feel quite slippy, quite ice rinky. But I can deal with that because this isn't exactly out of the ordinary for the time. There are frustrating bits of the platforming where you can die really easily. This does make Castlevania 64 quite a challenging game. There is no way around that. But could you imagine how much more difficult this would be with a 30% cut to the FPS? New to the Castlevania formula is climbing. This is something that hadn't been in previous games, and it's realised pretty well here. It's not great, but it's a cool new thing to add, and it did make me feel like I was playing some kind of forerunner to the early 3D platformer. The game also includes vampire states and poison states, which are essentially just debuffs to your character, with the exception of the turning into a vampire mechanic. That's really, really cool. If you get bitten by a vampire, you can no longer use holy weapons. I think that's really awesome. It gives it a bit of an RPG-like feel. It doesn't go too deep into it, but we're just bringing some of these more modern aspects into the game. The game also has a day-night cycle, which is pretty cool, and it's quite Castlevania-esque. This isn't just aesthetic though, this also includes buffs and debuffs for various enemies, and there are whole sections of the castle that can only be done during the day or during the night. It would be quite annoying if you had to wait for 12 in-game hours to pass before you could go through a door, so there are actual items in the game called Sun and Moon cards, which you can play to spin the time on to sunrise or to sunset. This drip feeding of new features as you go through the game, it does feel very modern. If you compare this to other games of the time, Castlevania 64 is actually doing things that a lot of other games weren't. The latter part of the game is really just a series of towers of increasing difficulty. I imagine this is due to the fact that once Konami was 6 months into the game and they realised they hadn't actually made that much game, they just fell back on some of the more familiar Castlevania gameplay of old. We get classic Castlevania enemies, there's boss rushes, you fight death on the top of a tower, it even uses the music from Rondo of Blood, then you're onto a clock tower, and then before you know it, you're fighting Dracula. There are different endings depending on how quickly you complete the game, a bit like Rondo or a bit like Simon's Quest, but the endings in this game, oh my God, they are some crazy shit, man. I got the good ending and I ended up with this kid turning up on an evil Pegasus. Then I got sexy Dracula, and then I ended up being transported to some nightmare realm to fight Dracula's true form, which is this giant centipede demon. I don't know what's going on, but I just love all of this. I love all of this. Once you've defeated Dracula, Reinhard then gives this really rousing speech about how it was men's desire for power that allows Dracula to keep coming back. Mankind's eternal struggle isn't against external agents, it's against its own evils. I found this to be super poignant. Even if it is hard to take it seriously because it's just a bunch of rhombuses rubbing up against each other, but this was such a sincere ending. I love it. Castlevania 64 launched on the N64 in January 1999, having been delayed from a Christmas 98 release. No doubt Konami didn't want to compete with their own Metal Gear Solid and probably Ocarina of Time. Castlevania games had traditionally been launch titles, and I think had this game been a launch title, it would still be remembered as a banger. But 3 years into the N64's life, we'd already had Ocarina, GoldenEye, Resi 2, Turok. There were a lot of 3D horror action games that were emerging in this time, and they were starting to eat Castlevania's lunch. This is something that unfortunately we would see more of over the next few years. The game sold 640,000 copies, so it was no slouch, but for a franchise which had once been a system seller, Konami considered that a bit of a whimper. I've heard other reviewers refer to the early years of the 3D era as some awkward period. As games were moving away from the tried and tested 2D, early 3D games felt like a bit of a gamble. There was no standard, there was no boilerplate. But now I look at this era and I realise that this is what makes this so exciting. By abandoning what's known and thrusting yourself straight into unknown territory, exciting things often happened. Developers could and often did do anything. This was a changing and uncertain world. Konami were not resisting that. Growth is painful, but Konami were not content with staying where they were. And I think that deserves merit. Embracing something so new and so untested and just seeing what comes out of it. That's awesome. If you've ever seen any of my other videos, then you'll know that I pretty much refuse to be negative about anything. I always try and see the positives. Sometimes I have to work harder, and sometimes I don't have to work very hard at all. Castlevania 64, surprisingly, is the latter. This is a game which is clearly inspired by Simon's Quest. It's pulling from these very deep roots, but it's trying to make it a more open-ended and more RPG-like adventure game. They didn't quite get it right in the time they had, but I have just such massive respect for that attempt. Is Castlevania 64 worth playing today? Yes, it is. It does make for a bit of an odd entry in the whole Castlevania canon, but it fully explores the new, it embraces possibility. Instead of saying, well, we've always done it this way, they try a whole bunch of stuff for the first time. And I have nothing but love for it. Thanks very much for watching my longer breakdown of Castlevania N64. If you like Castlevania games, then check out my previous uploads. I'm slowly knocking my way through the whole series. And if you want to see more in the future, hit that subscribe button. Check out the links in the description to come join the Discord server and chat about vampires. And I'll see you in the next video. Alright, cheers. Ta-da.